Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura's Handmade Haven. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. This video is going to be the missing link between step 1 and step 2 of the scrappy quilt that I showed you guys that was a design by Tia Curtis called Berry Jam. So on my design wall behind me, you're going to see basically a finished Berry Jam quilt top and all the strip sets and then my background fabric that I have sewn together to get this really cool design and quilt top that will be ready to be quilted whenever I get around to quilting next. But in the meantime, part 1 I showed you how I cut all the strips and I sewed all of my focus fabrics end to end to end to end to end. And that's where I pretty much wrapped up that video. Well, then I released part 2 and I was like, hey, look at this. This is awesome. We're building this out. And then I got some comments that said, hey, wait, how did you get from part 1 to part 2? Because this background fabric was nowhere to be seen at the end of part 1, but it was already there on part 2. Well, I made some strip sets. So basically that's what I'm going to be running through very quickly with you today, and that way it will be the missing link. So consider this part 1.5 for the Berry Jam Scrappy Quilt. All right, so let's just kind of catch up between what part 1 and part 2 missed showing you. Basically, I have a huge pile of strips that I've cut and they're sewn end to end. Now, the first set of strips that I cut that were my focus fabric were all 2.5 inch. These are a different width. So this is like a different little project. I already have, I think, 4 of the Berry Jam quilt tops together. So these are very quick and easy projects. I love them so much. And each one of them is very unique, even though it's the same design. All of the colors and fabrics are different. So you can change out the background fabric. As you saw in part 1, I had like a teal background, a kind of a medium to dark shade. And then the one that I showed you on the design wall, it has a darker brown, but it's actually a pattern. It's not a solid. It doesn't read as a solid. There's actually kind of a stripe in that background. So you can totally change the feel of this quilt just by switching out the background fabric and leaving the focus fabrics the exact same. So in my hand here, I have a pile of strips that are sewn end to end, and this is my focus fabric. So what I have done is I have cut background fabric in varying widths, and I'm going to sew one of those to these strips and keep going. And then as I get those sewn, I'm going to sew them together and build out basically like a strip set, just like you would be doing for some of like a 9 patch or a 12 patch or a 16 patch, where you can build your strip sets and then cut them to get that striped segment to attach to your block. So this is all going to go on the floor beside me by the machine. And then I'm going to grab one of my background fabric strips that are already cut, and I'm going to sew these together. And when I get to the end of this is actually a 108, just so you know what I'm working with. You can use 45, it's not that big of a deal, but I had some 108 and I was like, that's what I want to use. So when I get to the end of the 108, I will cut this, grab my next strip, and sew again. And then when I get enough of those together, I will sew those 2 strips into 4, 6, and 8. Now, the one thing that I told you, that I'm telling you in part 2 that I want to mention here, just in case you watch these in order, is that you don't want that strip set to get wider than your cutting mat. In fact, I would keep it a little narrower than your cutting mat, just because I run into problems if I folded it over, if it wasn't perfectly flat, then your strip sets won't be perfectly straight when you cut them. So make sure you keep your strips, your cutting mat size in mind when you're making the width of your strip sets. All right, so I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to sew for a little bit, and then I'm going to get a strip set together and cut it so you can see what you missed between part 1 and part 2 in my video series. This really is just straight sewing. One thing that I do like to do when I'm doing these, let me see if I can find it real quick. Yes. I have basically a magnetic seam guide that I put on my machine right next to my 1/4 inch piecing foot. I have it on just the basic straight stitch on my Juki DX7, and I am just going to sew. Now, this type of project, I love this for when I want to sew, when I need that little bit of mental therapy. That's usually what I call my sewing, but I don't want to have to think too much. This is mindless sewing. So let's just sew a few of these strips, build out a strip set, and cut it so you can see what I failed to show you between part 1 and part 2. All right, so this is what I was talking about. When I get to the end of my background fabric, I'm just going to cut that off. And that way I have these two strips there together. Now I'm going to grab my next piece of background fabric and I'm going to do the exact same thing. And I'm going to do this several times. Now my background fabric is cut at different widths, and that's just because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted a little more interest. I didn't want the background strips all the same exact size. All of my focus fabrics are the same size now. Those were all personal choices, not something that you necessarily have to do. Definitely go ahead and customize that to what you like and what you think looks most pleasing to your aesthetic taste. All right, so now I have 6 sets of 2 strips each sewn together. So I have basically 12 strips sewn together, and I do have varying widths of my background fabric. All of my focus fabric is the same width, but it definitely wouldn't need to be. That's just how I'm choosing to do this. And basically now what I'm going to do is just start building out a strip set. That's what I'm calling it. It's kind of like a panel set or a strip panel. I don't know what you want to call it. I'm calling it a strip set because I'm just going to take these and just start sewing them together to build them out and make them wider. All right, so now I have 4 strips together, and I'm just going to run this back down all the way because I'm just going to keep building on this base. That's just how I'm choosing to do this. If you want to put a couple sets of 4 together and then sew those together, you could do that. This is just how I've decided to do this part. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is just grab my next strip set. So I have another set of 2. And once again, I'm just going to sew that on to this. Okay, so the only thing that I want you to keep in mind when you're building out these strip sets is that it would be my recommendation that you do not allow this strip set to get wider than your cutting mat. And the reason for that is because I had some issues just because of all of the seams and the strips. You run the risk of not being able to cut your rounds straight. And that'll make more sense in just a few minutes because I'm going to add just a couple more strips onto this and then we're going to make some rounds. Okay, at this point I have sewn 6 of my focus fabric and 6 of my background fabric strips into a really, really long strip set. But it's about, it's probably about 18 to 19 inches wide. Now remember, my cutting mat is 18 by 24, so I didn't want to get wider than 24 because otherwise it becomes a little bit of a chore in order to make sure you keep your border strips or your rounds in a straight cut every time that you go through. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this over to my ironing board, press it out really good and flat, and then we're going to head to the cutting mat and I'll show you how I got from part 1 to part 2. All right, so we are back over at the cutting mat, and what I'm going to do is just start cutting those borders or those rounds that we'll use to construct our scrappy quilt. So as I said, I've just sewn my strips together, right? And there really was no, I didn't really put too much thought into that. I Started by sewing all these focus fabric strips end to end. I have them in a huge pile. As you saw, I cut my background fabric strips in different widths, and I sewed them on. I sewed the focus fabric to a background fabric to make sets of 2. Then I sewed those sets of 2 into a set of 12. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my ruler and I'm going to start cutting off the borders or the rounds that I need for my quilt. And what I've done is I have pressed this out pretty good and flat, and it should be pretty close to being straight across here. I'm just going to line this up and I'm just going to start cutting my rounds. Now, if you want more information on how to cut those or specifics on how to do this, then please make sure you purchase the pattern from Tia Curtis. The link is in the description box below. I will tell you that I have modified the pattern quite a bit to just be a little, I don't know, I'm going to say a little quicker for me, just to have some mindless sewing projects to do. But her pattern is amazing and it answers a ton of questions that you may be having about why I'm doing certain things a certain way, and just, you know, check it out. So that's what I would say about this. I'm just going to cut these strips and make sure that I keep them somewhat straight. And sometimes you get, you know, I might get a little off or whatever, and I'll just straighten it back up and cut again. Continue cutting my 108 long strip set panel to form a whole bunch of these. And then in part 2, you'll see how these turn into the Berry Jam quilt. So let me grab a few things so we can wrap up this part 1.5. Alright, so I really hope this video answers some questions that I definitely left out some information between part 1 and part 2 of the Scrappy project. But just to do a really quick recap, just so I can get you from part 1 to part 2. In part 1, we took all of those fabric scraps that we cut and we just sewed them end to end to end. And we ended up with a huge pile of scraps, all sewn end to end, just a bunch of strips sewn together. Then I cut out a whole bunch of strips out of my background fabric. Now remember, I'm using 108, but you can definitely use 45 inch as well. And your background fabric is the one, when you look up the wall here, this is the brown, and this quilt is going to be teal. So really it's whatever color you want your background to be. Obviously it should be complementary with the scraps that you're using, but for the most part the background fabric can be whatever color you want. You just want to make sure you have enough of it to get all the way through the quilt. Then we took the focus fabric strips and the background fabric strips and we sewed them into a big strip set. Now remember my tip, do not get wider than your cutting mat, because you want to be able to lay this out flat on your cutting mat and cut these little border rounds out one at a time to the width that you want. So if you want more information on that, you need to make sure you get Tia's pattern, and it's called Berry Jam. A link to her site and to that pattern is in the description box down below. After we got that panel or that strip set together in that huge 108 length, we then started cutting out these border rounds, and that is where I picked up with part 2 of the Berry Jam Scrappy quilt. So I hope this will really help fill in some gaps. I hope it answered some questions for some of you. I do apologize that I did not include that information in part 1 or part 2. It was truly an oversight on my part, and I completely understand why you were so lost. Hey, so until next time, I hope you find joy in all you do. Carve out some time for crafting and creating, and remember, it's always better to make stuff up.